Madam President.
Senator from Kentucky.
Today I will offer an amendment to pay for the spending in this bill. This is not something unusual. I do this day in, day out. It's been part of the reason I ran for office, that we shouldn't add more debt to our country without trying to pay for it by maybe reducing spending from less wasteful spending. But in the last week or so, we've seen a manufactured crisis. Rarely has there been a manufactured crisis so intense. A fake furor instigated by partisans more concerned with scoring points than telling the truth. But for some of us, the truth is still important. The mob and demagogues in this body accuse me of holding up this bill for political points. They obviously don't know much about politics, because there certainly hasn't been any political gain by my holding this bill for debate and amendment. But I think it's important that we do this, rather than rush through and everybody says, no questions asked, please. Sounds a little bit more like an authoritarian atmosphere than it would be a democracy, to actually have debate, discussion, and amendments. That's all we've asked for. In fact, last week when we were granted the amendments, we said to the other side, let's have the vote last week. And all of those who were in such a furor, all those who were so hysterical that the world was ending, said, oh, we can't vote on it. It's not convenient last week because some of our Democrat members have already gone home for the weekend. So when the mob was told last week they could have the vote, they said no. It's a manufactured crisis. As of today, the fund in question has $2 billion in it. And no one is being denied medical care. So let's have an honest debate. Let's have an honest debate about whether it matters to this country, whether we're $22 trillion in debt, and whether or not when we have new spending programs, no matter how charitable, no matter how needed, when we have new spending programs, whether or not we're going to pay for them by reducing spending in wasteful programs. It is perhaps an historical anomaly that this bill appropriates unlimited funds for a virtually unlimited time period. So what would you think if someone came to you and they had a good cause and they said, you know, my neighbor's house is burnt down and I want to help them and I want to give them unlimited money for an unlimited period of time? That wouldn't be wise. No one would do that. So why do we, in our hysteria, throw out all common sense and say we're not going to approach this as if we don't have a problem? We have this enormous problem in our country. We're borrowing over $1 million a minute. My amendment today is to offer to pay for the $10 billion in the first 10 years. Now, realize that the bill as written is not a 10-year bill, it's a 72-year bill. It goes to the year 2092. To my knowledge, we have never, ever had a bill that was unlimited in the dollar amount and unlimited in the time period. Mine would be to pay for the first 10 years of this. The pay would become by reducing mandatory spending by 0.06%. That's 0.06 of other mandatory spending. We would also at the same time exempt Medicare, Social Security, and Veterans Affairs from cuts. So we would exempt the vast bulk of mandatory spending, but we would still say, if this is a wise expenditure of money, if we need more money for this fund, we would simply take it from something that is less pressing. No matter how good a cause may be, it makes no sense to borrow from China to pay for our immediate concerns. Spending someone else's money is not charity. Spending borrowed money is just not wise or sound governance. Being a legislator should be about making choices, about deciding priorities. For example, which is more important? Spending $275 million teaching foreign countries how to apply for U.S. foreign aid, teaching foreign countries how to get our money, how to fill out the grant process. Is that more important than the spending in this bill? We'll never know, because the people who promote this bill aren't willing to cut any spending. They're not willing to look at waste, and we wonder why we have waste run from top to bottom in our government, because no one's willing, even for a good cause, to say, well, why don't we cut out some of this waste? Why don't we quit spending money teaching foreigners how to apply to get more of our money? To pay for more pressing concerns, shouldn't someone ask whether it is wise to spend $300,000 studying Japanese quail to see if they are more sexually promiscuous on cocaine? That's your money. So when some money is being asked for a good cause, ask why we couldn't eliminate money we're spending on awful things that should never have been wasted in the federal government. To pay for more pressing concerns, shouldn't someone ask why we continue to spend $50 billion a year building bridges and roads and hotels and gas stations in Afghanistan? Perhaps that money could be better spent here at home. The debate today is not over the spending of the money, it's over whether or not, when we do spend money, even for a good cause, whether or not we should cut corresponding money that we're wasting around the world. Many of it not helping American citizens, many of it going to foreign countries and foreign people. To pay for more pressing concerns, shouldn't someone ask why we had a study last year that spent $2 million seeking to know the question, if someone in front of you in the cafeteria line sneezes on the food, are you more or less likely to pick up the food and eat it? Seriously, this is where your tax dollars are going. So if we have a better cause and we want to fund this fund that we're talking about today, couldn't we say we won't spend next year $2 million studying whether if someone sneezes on your food, you're more or less likely to take the food? Shouldn't we be forced as a Congress to make decisions instead of just saying, well, it's a good cause, and so therefore we should not use our brain, we should put blinders on, we shouldn't think about it, and we should just say, well, it's a good cause, so let's just borrow the money from China. Do you think that helps us as a country? Isn't part of legislating trying to prioritize spending, not just adding to the debt? Now, the left-wing mob maintains that Republicans have lost the moral high ground and they can't talk about debt anymore because we supported a tax cut. Poppycock. This is misinformation, this is fake news, and this is plainly people just not paying any attention to what goes on around here. During the tax cut, which I supported, I offered cuts to mandatory spending to pay for the tax cut. The media seems to have forgotten this, but I forced a vote on the floor to say, yes, we may be cutting taxes, and if it affects the deficit, we should pay for it. Interestingly, though, the left-wing mob doesn't want to admit that when we actually cut tax rates, we actually got more money. So the revenue coming in last year was actually greater than the previous year. The tax cut didn't add to the deficit. The deficit went up because we continue to spend money and we actually added more spending. The curve of spending increases actually rose faster than the revenue coming in. So when the tax cut happened, I offered an amendment to cut spending to pay for it. This is a fact, and the left-wing mob and all their buddies in the media can do whatever they want, say whatever they want because it's a free country, but it's an absolute out-and-out lie that Republicans who voted for this tax cut actually also were not concerned with spending. I, for one, was and offered an amendment to cut spending. The tax cut also was passed under a law that we've had on the books for some time. It's called pay-go law. This is a law that should be working even on a bill like this current bill, but we exempt ourselves from it all the time. The current bill actually exempts the pay-go rules. If you increase spending by $10 billion, you got to decrease it by $10 billion somewhere else. It's been on the books for a long time. But like everything else Congress does, they try to bring in rules to say, you know what, we're going to try to control the debt and spending by forcing ourselves. When we come up with some new spending of $10 billion, we'll have to come up with something to cut to pay for it. But what happens is Congress just waives the rules. So it's not that we don't have rules that should help with the budget. We've got hundreds of rules. The pay-go rule was a good rule, but it gets ignored. So when we passed the tax cut, if the projections were that the deficit was going to go up, guess what? The pay-go rules would say there has to be automatic spending cuts across the board. This is something I support. So what happened? About a month after the tax cut, big spending bill comes through here. Both parties are guilty, Republicans and Democrats. They love to spend money more than anything else. Big spending bill comes through, and guess what? They waive the rule on pay-go. But at that time, I also brought up an amendment that said, hey, you guys shouldn't waive the pay-go rule. If the tax cut causes the debt to go up, we should cut spending across the board. So let's be very clear around here. There are those of us who have been consistent from day one that the debt does matter. There is no particular animus towards this bill. In the last year, I've done this probably a half a dozen times. In the last 2 years, I've probably done it 24 times. That means every spending bill. A month ago, it was spending for the border. I support money to be spent on the border, but I don't support doing if it adds to the deficit. The amendment that I have today is identical to the amendment I had a month ago saying border spending. Even if you want to do it, we should cut money from somewhere else where it's not as much needed and where it's being wasted. I did it 3 months ago for the hurricane disaster relief. Every bit of new spending, it doesn't matter whether it's a good cause, bad cause, or in-between cause. We need to not keep adding to the debt. This is a problem. We borrow over $1 million, close to $2 million every minute. This is a problem for our country. We are eroding the foundation of this country with so much debt, $22 trillion in debt. So the tax cut was passed under the pay-go rules. I voted not to suspend the pay-go rules. I voted to actually have spending cuts to offset any increase in the deficit from the tax cut. But the establishment of both parties moved to waive this pay-go requirement. I forced a vote, and only 8 senators voted, which shows you where the real problem is. Why does the deficit go up so much? There's not one Democrat in Congress that cares a flip about the deficit. Not one Democrat in Congress will lift a finger to restrain government spending. They're for everything. You name it, they're for it. But the problem is Republicans aren't so good on this either. There's only a handful of Republicans who actually care about the debt, and many of them will vote consistently to raise the debt limit and vote to add new debt. Today's vote, though, is but a prelude of next week's vote. This is the preliminary. This is the introduction to our problem in our country, over $10 billion. Next week, it's the enormity of the entire budget. Next week, both parties, and watch this closely, people say, oh, Republicans can't get along with Democrats. Guess what? They get along just swell when it comes to spending money and adding to the debt. This bill will pass overwhelmingly today without any concern for the debt or paying for it, but next week will be even worse. We have something called the debt ceiling. Every time we spend more money that comes in taxes, it approaches a debt ceiling. The debt ceiling says you can't borrow any more money, and so conservatives say, well, we should reform our ways and quit giving away money to Afghanistan and Mexico and all these different countries. We should have reform involved with raising debt ceiling. What's going to come about next week is no debt ceiling for 2 years till after the next presidential election. It's a terrible idea. It's fiscal insanity. They also will vote to forever get rid of the sequester caps. In 2011, amongst the Tea Party movement, when more people became concerned about the deficit and spending, we actually came in and we had a reform. And for the first time, we didn't cut spending. We slowed down the rate of growth of spending. But in doing so, the deficit was narrowing. For a couple of years there, we were doing better. And then what happened is basically both parties once again came together. The Republicans said, we want to be in every war overseas we can possibly get involved, and we want to have more money spent on the military. The liberals said, we need more money for welfare, and guess what? They aren't at odds. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. The Republicans and Democrats agree on one thing. Spending money is the most important thing they can do. The deficit doesn't matter. So when we come back and we readdress this issue next week, what we're going to find is they're going to explode the debt ceiling. There'll be no limits on the debt ceiling for 2 years, and they're getting rid of all pretense of having any spending caps. A majority of Republicans, unfortunately, will even vote to get rid of the budget caps and to eliminate the debt ceiling for 2 years. This is sad. Today, though, the Senate has a chance to vote to pay for this $10 billion bill with very, very modest reductions in mandatory spending. Reductions that actually exempt Medicare, Social Security, and Veterans Affairs. Americans, particularly conservatives, need to sit up and watch closely how their senators vote. For today's vote is about whether your representative really cares at all about the disaster that is our $22 trillion debt. Madam President, I call up my amendment 929 and ask that it be reported by number.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Senator from Kentucky, Mr. Paul, proposes an amendment numbered 929. Madam President.
Democrat Leader.
Madam President, I'm speaking on the bill as well as the amendments. In a short time, the Senate will vote on and pass a permanent reauthorization of the 9/11 Victims' Compensation Fund. In my short time here on the floor, I can't do justice to the years upon years of work by the first responders, by labor leaders, by advocates that led to this moment. But to suffice it to say, this is not a day of joy for them or for this bill's authors. Rather, it's a day of relief. For 18 years, those first responders, some of whom are here in the gallery, have watched their brothers and sisters get sick because they rushed bravely to the towers at Ground Zero. At first, they were told by the government the air was safe. It was not safe. And we began hearing of cancers that people never got when they were 38 or 40 or 42, occurring all of a sudden in firefighters and police officers. And they only had one thing in common: they'd all rushed to the towers. And we had to persuade people that this was real. They had to persuade people because they saw their brothers and sisters dying. Then they endured folks telling them that they were crazy for thinking they had sicknesses they suffered that had anything to do with 9/11. They were not crazy, and the people who told them they were, shame on them, including government agencies and others. And then, once it was confirmed beyond a shadow of a doubt that these cancers and respiratory illnesses were linked to the toxic dust and ash around the pile, it became an exhausting struggle to get Congress to provide the care they needed, but they couldn't afford. There were numerous false dawns and delays, temporary reauthorizations. We were forced to wait and wait and wait, compromise, quote, with people's lives. Excuse after excuse. Some senators voted proudly for tax cuts unpaid for to the wealthiest of Americans, but demanded offsets for these folks who had served us like our soldiers have served us, like our armed services. Thank God, those excuses, those delays end today for good. And our first responders can go home and do what they want to do, tend to their own health, their family's health, the health of their brothers and sisters who are suffering and ailing, and tend to the families who have lost loved ones but are still part of their families. The 9/11 health program is already permanent. Soon, we will make the Victims' Compensation Fund virtually permanent as well. And the twilight struggle of nearly 2 decades to get these brave men and women what they deserve will be, hopefully and finally, complete. Once we defeat the few amendments before us, amendments that would delay the bill further, if not kill it, we should pass this bill overwhelmingly so we can send the first responders, those here and everywhere, home where they belong, with their family, their friends. These are the same soldiers of valor who selflessly risked their lives in our wars and conflicts overseas. There was a war right in the city I love. And these were our bravest soldiers. They rushed to the towers. Maybe some people were alive. Maybe there were people who could be saved. We didn't know that then. We saw the families holding signs. Have you seen my sister Mary? Have you seen my son Jim? And these people rushed to the towers to see if the Jim or Mary or the others were alive and didn't ask about themselves. Now, we're asking America to stand by them. Every American, every senator, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, that shouldn't matter on an issue like this. We are now at the very end of a long struggle. The struggle may end for the people in this chamber, including those of us like Senator Gillibrand and myself, who worked so hard through the years for this legislation. But the struggle does not end for those who are sick or who may get sick, and for their families. At least we are giving them some degree of help, because they gave us so much help on that horrible day, 9/11, and those that ensued just afterwards. Let's pass this bill once and for all. Let's do our duty to them, to America, to our ideals. I yield the floor.
Senator from New York.
Madam President, I rise to join my colleagues in speaking about our 9/11 heroes. I want to thank Senator Schumer for his extraordinary leadership, his unwavering support, his dedication to taking this across the finish line, and his unbelievable willingness to lift up the voices of people who were not being listened to. So thank you to Senator Schumer. I want to first note that while we are debating this bill, there is a wake happening on Staten Island right now for Detective Christopher Cranston. A father of 5, he was only 48 years old, but he will be buried on Thursday because of the months of work he did on the pile at Ground Zero and Fresh Kills landfill. He spent his 20th anniversary just a few weeks ago in chemotherapy. Madam President, the eyes of the nation are looking at this chamber today to see if we finally will stand by our 9/11 heroes for the rest of their lives. In a few minutes, heroes such as James Zadroga, Ray Pfeiffer, Lou Alvarez will have their names etched into the history books forever, which is where they belong. Their families are in the gallery today. Here again, walking the halls of this chamber and this Congress to be heard. Here again to ask one more time that this body do what's right, to stand by them in their gravest time of need. Their families are here today to watch whether this chamber will do what's right. They're standing here with so many others in the 9/11 community who have fought so hard to demand that Congress do the right thing. So let's honor their service today. Let's actually honor their commitment to coming here time and time again, not for themselves, but for their brothers and sisters who are sick, who are still dying all across this country. 7 are dying a week. Let's honor their ultimate sacrifice they paid for responding to the call of duty when the nation needed them most. Responders came from every state across this country. Last week, we lost Richard Driscoll, the 200th firefighter, FDNY firefighter, to succumb to a 9/11 illness. More police officers have died since 9/11 than on 9/11. More than 10,000 people have been certified with a 9/11-related cancer, with more being diagnosed every day. More will get sick, more will die. Some of them won't be diagnosed for years. And that includes responders. And it includes the residents, teachers, and students who stayed downtown because the government told them the air was safe. They told them it was safe to breathe, even though it was not. This bill won't change any of that. But we can finally let the people in the gallery sitting here watching us today, witnessing, we will let the people in the gallery go home, knowing that the government will truly never forget. We owe them that promise. And today we have the opportunity to let them get back to their lives, be with their families, and exhale. They at least deserve that. I want to thank Senator Gardner for his leadership on this bill, Senator McConnell for staying true to his commitment. And I said earlier, I want to thank Senator Schumer for being a tremendous advocate, leader, and partner who never, ever gave up. And I want to thank every single person who has spent their time and energy coming here again and again over these many years to advocate for this bill and for their brothers and sisters. I ask every senator to have empathy, just that bit of care for someone else. Vote yes on this bill and stand by our first responders. I also want to urge every colleague of mine to reject the amendments that are being put forward. First, the amendment from my colleague from Utah. Unfortunately, this amendment would only accomplish one thing. It would make these first responders have to go through this entire process again in just a few years. It would force sick and dying police officers, firefighters, and other 9/11 first responders to waste even more of their precious time coming here, away from their families, away from their loved ones, from their cancer treatments, from their last moments in their homes and communities, traveling back and forth to Washington, lobbying Congress to pass the bill for the fourth time. Do not fall into this trap. Our 9/11 heroes deserve this program as is written in the bill without these amendments, which will only force them to have to come back here again and again. Stand up for our heroes. End the games. Let's reject this amendment, pass the bill, let our heroes go home and live in peace where they can breathe. And finally, exhale. I yield the floor to my colleague from Utah.
Madam President.
All time has expired. Senator from Utah.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent to deliver my remarks and to delay the onset of the vote until after my remarks have been completed.
Without objection.
Madam President, the September 11th Victims' Compensation Fund has for many years compensated the brave men and women who responded to the horrific events of 9/11. And it's been a worthy use of money. Of the $7.4 billion authorized for the fund since 2011, however, $5.2 billion have already been paid out. So since February of this year, money has gotten tight, and claimants' benefits have had to be reduced. I believe it's only right for Congress to reauthorize and replenish the fund so that we can make those beneficiaries whole. The bill before us today, Madam President, has a peculiar feature, one that I believe requires our attention. The bill authorizes the program for 72 years and does not specify a dollar amount. If you look to page 2 of the bill, lines 8 through 10, it makes clear that this program is funded through 2092 and funded to the tune of such sums as may be necessary. In other words, without any finite authorization, it offers no way to ensure that the money actually gets to its intended beneficiaries and is not lost in government bureaucracy or misuse. That is, in fact, how we make sure that government programs get to where they need to go, by specifying not only the purpose of the fund, but also identifying how much it is that we're spending. In 2011, the 9/11 Victims Fund has always had finite authorizations, and it has always had an absolutely excellent, outstanding record of avoiding waste, fraud, and abuse. 9/11 survivors and responders deserve no less going forward. That's why I'm offering a simple amendment to this bill, one that would authorize $10.2 billion in additional funding for the 9/11 Victims Fund over the next 10 years. Now, to be clear, that is the full amount that the Congressional Budget Office has estimated is necessary for covering all claims through 2029. My amendment wouldn't end there. It would go further to authorize an additional $10 billion to be paid out in subsequent decades. It will not block or delay this bill's consideration, let alone its passage, nor does it have as its intended effect any kind of downgrading of the benefits that we would be paying. But it would make sure that the money gets to the victims and the first responders who need it most, to the intended beneficiaries, rather than remaining vulnerable to the kind of waste, fraud, and abuse that comes about whenever we authorize something until 2092 with such sums language. This isn't the normal way we normally do things. Now, my distinguished colleague and friend from New York just made the comment that if this amendment were to pass, that it would somehow make the victims of 9/11 go back here again and again and go through this process over and over again. I don't see that. Those facts are not borne out by the record, which again indicates that the Congressional Budget Office itself has acknowledged that the amount of money I'd be setting aside would be sufficient to fund this program. This is how we make government programs work. We fund things for a period of time and for an amount of money that we believe is sufficient. This would be, and for that reason I'm proposing this amendment. I therefore call up my amendment number 928 and ask that it be reported by number.
Clerk will report the amendment.
The senator from Utah, Mr. Lee, proposes an amendment number 928.
Under the previous order, the question occurs on Amendment 928.
Under the previous order, the question occurs under the underlying amendment 928.
Yeah. Is there a sufficient second?
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn,